Until the 20th century, the timeline of classical music history was more or less a straight line, a series of relatively consistent and coherent approaches one after another. Classical music in the 20th century was more like a complicated game of Tetris, a bunch of interlocking and overlapping pieces. Most music histories mark the end of Romanticism and the start of modernism as happening sometime in the early years of the 20th century, but it's a period that becomes much harder to pin things down into any one style. And this is a trend that only seems to exacerbate as the century progresses, to the extent that it becomes harder to summarise things into more than just a list of names. The rise of recording dramatically shaped how music was received, and arguably extended the influence of composers who might otherwise have disappeared. There's an interesting distinction in the century between composers whose music made a significant impact and those whose ideas were more important. This makes summarising events into a history perilous, as you risk overemphasising one or other of those two groups. Composers like Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff are amongst the most played of 20th century composers, for example, and yet as figures influencing the artistic tides of the century, both seem like minor figures. Other composers like Boulez and Schoenberg wielded enormous influence, even if their music itself remained comparatively rarely played. Let's start with some of the broader trends. You have the tail end of Romanticism, which never fully dies as a means of expression throughout the century. You have Expressionism, atonality, serialism, you have Neoclassicism, modality, the rise and influence of folk and world music, the dawn of the electronic age, American experimentalism. Later in the century you have minimalism, new complexity, spectralism, postmodernism, postminimalism, neo-romanticism, and by the 21st century the age of isms seems largely to have broken down and we're left with a sense of individual composers, each ploughing their own furrow. So let's go back to the start and look at some of the individual composers involved. The early years of the 20th century saw the tail end of the careers of several leading late Romantic composers. Mahler, whose last unfinished Symphony the 10th seems to foreshadow atonality. Debussy too might fall into this category. He died in 1918 and his early works came out of late Romanticism, but he's unmistakably modern in outlook, throwing away many of the devices of traditional harmony and exploring exotic influences from the East, the whole tone scale, modality, and an interest in sound for its own sake. He remains a huge influence on composers to this day. Puccini wrote several of his most popular operas in the early years of the century, which are among the most performed in the repertoire. And Richard Strauss's Salome and Elektra, the former of which Mahler called a live volcano, a subterranean fire, were huge operatic hits despite their relatively dissonant styles. Arnold Schoenberg is one figure who towers over the century in terms of influence, even if his music has rarely achieved the acceptance of a wider public. He too started firmly in the late Romantic world. The string sextet Verklärte Nacht is a particularly powerful work that draws together the German late Romantic influences of Brahms and Wagner. Only 13 years later, Schoenberg's style had moved on to sound like this. This is Pierrot Lunaire, Schoenberg's first expressionistic masterpiece, which pioneered both that weird semi-sung style known as Sprechstimme, as well as the small mixed ensemble which would become a central part of 20th century music. Schoenberg sought ways to break free of the harmonic approaches of the 19th century, developing ways of writing atonally, music without a tonal centre, and eventually developing the famous 12-tone approach in which all notes of the scale were treated equally. He was followed in this by his two pupils, Alban Berg and Anton Webern. The three together became known as the Second Viennese School, drawing a somewhat grandiose equivalence to the First Viennese School of Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven. Berg's expressionist operas Wozzek and later Lulu are thorny on first hearing, but are both rich with passion, humour and horror, and are key operatic works of the century. Webern condensed the 12-tone style to the other extreme, making really short fragmentary pieces, which in their quiet way are as passionate and intense as anything by Mahler. Expressionism as a style continued and resurfaced after World War II in composers like Bernd Alva Zimmermann, Hans Werner Henze and Peter Maxwell Davies. Debussy and his French compatriots Ravel and Erik Satie, as well as the later more minor composers known as Les Six, offered a lighter and more colourful avenue for 20th century music. Both Debussy and Ravel showed an interest in exotic cultures, whether local in the case of Ravel's love of Spanish music, or further afield in Debussy's interest in Javanese gamelan music. This drawing on other cultures as well as historical styles as a source of inspiration was one which lasted throughout the century. Igor Stravinsky is one of the giants of 20th century music, and he was constantly on the lookout for new sources of inspiration, whether it was the Russian folk music of his early masterpieces like The Firebird, Petrushka and The Rite of Spring, the classical masters during his neoclassical period, or 12-tone technique in his later period. Whether because of these influences or just his own huge talent, Stravinsky revitalized approaches to rhythm and harmony, and he's a figure as central to classical music in the 20th century as Picasso is to the art world. Another great Russian, Dmitri Shostakovich, also showed multiple influences on his work throughout his career, from jazz and vaudeville to Jewish folk songs, from the Romanticism of Mahler to the neoclassicism of Stravinsky himself. Shostakovich was said to be a particular fan of the latter's Symphony of Psalms. His early works were experimental and expressionistic until his denouncement by the Soviet regime of Joseph Stalin forced him to express himself more tentatively. His music offers a far darker and more grotesque alternative to Stravinsky's more optimistic spirit. Just as Stravinsky's music betrayed his Russian heritage, other composers wrote in highly individualistic styles, which could only have come from their respective homelands. Janacek wrote a series of brilliant operas inspired by the rhythms of the Czech language. Bartók plundered the Hungarian folk traditions for new sources of modernist inspiration. Szymanowski in Poland, Sibelius in Finland, De Falla in Spain, Vaughan Williams and later Benjamin Britten in England, George Gershwin and later Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein in the US, all drew on the sounds and inspirations of their respective homelands to forge individual voices. The Second World War seems to have had an effect on composers that can hardly be overstated, causing many to feel the need for a clean slate and a rebuilding of the musical languages from scratch. The fact that Olivier Messiaen managed to write his profoundly moving Quartet for the End of Time whilst a prisoner in a German prisoner of war camp remains one of the most shockingly impressive feats of human willpower. Messiaen went on to develop another highly individual style which mixed lush, hypersweet tunes with twittering bird calls, and a bold formal approach that eschewed transitions in favour of big building blocks of colour. Messiaen was influential on a younger generation that included Pierre Boulez, Karlheinz Stockhausen and Yanis Xenakis, who went on to become the leaders of the post-war avant-garde centred around the International Summer Course for New Music in Darmstadt in Germany. In the uncertain years after the war, Boulez and Stockhausen seemed to offer a sense of certainty of purpose. Peak Boulez was probably Le Morte sans Maître from 1955, a sort of mid-century riposte to Schoenberg's Pierrot, and a dazzlingly original sound world. Stockhausen's experimentalism saw him take in a huge range of approaches, from the three orchestras of Gruppen to the electronic work Gesang der Junglinge. And the influence of early experiments into the new medium of electronic music affected many of this generation. György Ligeti took electronic sounding effects and brought them into the orchestral world, along with a sharp sense of humour and a fine ear for colour. And Xenakis reimagined architectural ideas in oral form. But eventually the leaders of this avant-garde found their certainties gradually faded. Boulez retreated into conducting and endlessly revising his tiny output of pieces, and Stockhausen headed towards ever weirder and more megalomaniac territories. The American John Cage met Boulez in Paris in 1949, and the two of them became pen pals. Their friendship cooled after Cage developed an interest in chants and exploring ways of removing himself from the compositional process altogether. Cage is another figure who made a huge impact, even if his music itself is relatively rarely played. He was at the forefront of a wave of American experimentalism that had started earlier with Edgar Varese and Henry Cowell. American mavericks like Morton Feldman, Lou Harrison and Conlon Nancarrow forged more of those unique paths. The discovery of Charles Ives' music in the 1960s felt like part of this wave, even though much of it was written shockingly early. Though it was written in the 1910s and 1920s, Ives' Fourth Symphony sounds every bit as radical as Berriot's 1969 collage masterpiece, Symphonia. In the 1960s, an entirely new sound emerged. The minimalism of Steve Reich has its origins in West African rhythms, and together with composers like Philip Glass and later John Adams, minimalism went on to become one of the dominant forces in contemporary music. Its after effects, sometimes called post-minimalism, can still be heard in composers like John Luther Adams and David Lang. So-called holy minimalists like Arvo Pärt, John Tavener and Henryk Górecki use similar techniques to more spiritual ends. In Europe, composers attended the new research centre built by Pierre Boulez, IRCAM, and out of that emerged what became known as the Spectral School, compositions by people like Tristan Murail and Gérard Grisey that re-examined the building blocks of sound with the aid of computers and attempted to build new sound worlds out of them. Louis Andriessen fused aspects of minimalism with jazz and European modernism. Other composers like Harrison Birtwistle or George Benjamin in the UK, Per Norgard in Denmark, Takemitsu in Japan, and Magnus Lindberg in Finland also took the modernist project forward. In Hungary, György Kurtág quietly forged his own path, building on the miniature fragmentary worlds of Webern. At the other extreme, the school of new complexity headed by Brian Ferneyhough wrote scores that seemed a parody of impossibility. Meanwhile, Lutosławski in Poland and Dutilleux in France both created rich orchestral sound worlds underpinned by a humanistic spirit that was rare for their times. Kaija Saariaho and Unsuk Chin became among the first female composers to receive widespread international recognition, and both managed to incorporate significant electronic parts into many of their orchestral works. As we near the century's end, it becomes harder to pick out trends and composers that we can be confident will form an important part of history. Thomas Addis is an astoundingly accomplished composer whose works, like those of Stravinsky and Shostakovich, managed to be both eclectic and instantly recognisable at the same time. In 2018, he's one of the world's leading composers, but his first major orchestral success, Asila, just sneaks into our century with a premiere in 1999. So let me know in the comments if you think we need any more game-based histories of music, maybe a Pac-Man version of the Baroque era or a Space Invaders version of the Romantic era. If you enjoyed the video, do please like and subscribe and share with your friends. And thanks so much as ever to my patrons over at Patreon for supporting the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.